Hey guys, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another wonderful, lovely video. And this one's we're going to be doing some screen capturing and some, basically, we're going to be reviewing some stuff on the internet. Really, what inspired this whole video, again, was Chris at Dixieland Farm. Either he put a comment on one of my videos or I replied to one of his videos. I honestly don't remember how this happened, but he said something to the effect of only, really top 40 type of music being remembered, in decades to come. And how only the real popular stuff is remembered from decades past. So I thought, hey, that is a great idea for a video, and I thought, maybe an expanded look at that a bit would make for some compelling type of something to talk about in a video. So we're going to kind of look at a bit more of the distant past, and then we're going to, kind of zero in on, more present and all that. So, I'm sorry, the more recent past and the present. Then we're going to kind of look to the future. We're going to try to extrapolate all that fun stuff. So, let me go ahead and shrink myself. Okay, it's a good size. All right, so let's go ahead. The stuff that I'm going to look at, we're going to look up first, and I apologize for forgetting to do this before the videos. We're going to, of course, just look at the three of the most well-known classical composers, right? Just to see when were these people alive. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so Vivaldi was in the 1600s. Sorry, I don't know this off the top of my head when these people... Okay, 1700s. And Beethoven... Okay, roughly... Okay, also the 1700s. So Beethoven and Mozart relatively close together. Vivaldi, 100 years before that, 1600s, 16 to 1700s. So the point I'm trying to make is these are three artists, obviously, that many people still know, right? Back from, obviously, hundreds of years ago. And to be truthful, like I said, I didn't even realize just before that tiny amount of research that I just did that, I didn't know if Beethoven and Mozart were relatively close together or not as far as time period go. Obviously, Vivaldi was earlier. I'm sure if I went down the rabbit hole of, famous classical composers, we'd have even more, for lack of a better term, time differences. They probably stretch over centuries, right? And, I'm kind of going over the prehistory of recorded music here, and I'm talking about what's still recognized today. Only precious few artists, I mean, from a period of, we'll say the birth of Western music, and now precious few composers are generally known. I'd say to the general population, probably, maybe 10 to 15 composers are known who they are, and there's really any familiarity with them at all. And we're talking hundreds of years of, time, which is a long time, because back then, there was mass media in music didn't really exist. So what's remembered now is a tiny, tiny fraction of what came out in that time period. An extremely long time period. Extraordinarily few artists are remembered now. So anyway, moving on. Let's talk about, we're actually going to want to talk about, things that happened at least in the last 100 years. I'm going to kind of start off in the 1930s here because going back further than that, I mean, the 20s, that's almost 100 years ago. I don't think many people are going to remember much from the 20s. Let's see. Just for fun, we'll look at... Yeah, I don't know what any of this stuff is from the 20s. So anyway, but even if we go to the 1930s, all we get are birth of Ray Charles. Obviously, I know who Ray Charles is. I mean, he was born. He didn't make music in the 1930s. Florence Henderson. Isn't that the one from the Brady Bunch? Leonard Cohen. Okay, I've heard of him. Frankie Valli. Pat Boone. This is when... people were, maybe being born. Okay, so the 30s, as far as like actual musical acts from the 30s, I don't think much of anything is remembered now. And we're not, I mean, that's close to 100 years ago, but not quite. So stuff from the 1930s is, I'm sure, largely forgotten at this point, and that's much more recent than the classical composers I was just talking about. And stuff from the 30s has been mostly forgotten. Now, to be fair, that was definitely very early in recorded music history. It wasn't really well established yet in the 30s. Yeah, obviously it existed, but it wasn't like this massive thing. And now the decade that we're on now, the 40s, a couple of really important things happened in the 40s. The 40s, I think, is when, radio really took off as kind of a giant mass media, and almost everybody had a radio in the 40s, and pretty much everybody listened to the radio. So obviously that led to a huge explosion in the popularity of music for different folks. So let's go ahead and look at what was popular in the 1940s. So let's take a look here. It looks like swing, big band, jazz, Latin, and country. Well, of those types of music, I'd say probably the only one that has any real popularity nowadays, of course, is country music and Latin music, probably, well, more in Latin countries than the U.S. So let's go ahead and take a look and see who exactly was big in that time period. Okay, it looks like Old Blue Eyes Frank Sinatra was pretty popular back then. He's pretty well known in pop culture, just because he's kind of just referenced a lot and talked about a lot. And then we have Bing Crosby. And the only reason I know who Bing Crosby is, of course, is the song White Christmas, and I think it was a movie too. Really, my parents and grandparents would tend to watch stuff with Bing Crosby in it or whatever. Myself, my interest in it was exceedingly low. It's not something that I would really, kind of watch on my own. It's just not something that had great interest for me. Moving on, let's see what else. Who else was big? Al Jolson. Okay, I'm familiar with him. Billy Murray. I know who Bill Murray is, but I don't think it's the same guy. No idea who Billy Murray is. Cab Calloway. Nope. Eddie Cantor. Nope. Dorsey Brothers. Nope. Let's see. Ooh, Sinatra was the first teen idol, apparently. Okay. Lawrence Welk. Oh, God. Yeah, okay. Glenn Miller. Let's see. Ella Fitzgerald. Oh, yeah. A Tisket, a Tasket. Okay, I've heard that one. Billie Holiday. Okay, I've heard of that. Yep, okay. Country music. Let's see. It looks like Roy Rogers. He was, obviously in film, but also did music. Gene Autry. Sort of know who that is. Ernest Tubb, no idea who that is. Of course, the original Hank Williams, I know who that is. But the point is, the vast majority, a lot of these I don't know. Maddox Brothers and Rose, Molly O'Day, Lulu Bell, no idea. Okay, Les Paul designed and built the first electric guitar. That's obviously important. And there you go. And they're talking about White Christmas specifically there. Anyway, as far as the music of that decade, I would say the majority of the people who grew up with that, not all of them, but I'd say the overwhelming majority of people who grew up in that time period have, passed on by this point. Because we're talking, almost 80 years ago. So, yeah, a lot of them not around anymore. And like I said, the only reason I'm even really familiar with any of this stuff is because my parents and grandparents would play it. So I got exposed to it. And the question is, am I passing this on to my kids? No, because it's not something that I particularly am a huge fan of. So my kids aren't getting really exposed to this. So, when, say, my generation passes on, will anybody really remember this stuff? Hard to say. Moving on. We're now going to talk about the 50s. And I think the 50s music has held on to pop culture a lot better than the 40s stuff has, for a couple of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons, I think, the stuff from the 50s, we'll say the 50s and onwards, a lot of music from the 50s is still somewhat regularly recycled in pop culture. People will do cover versions of songs from the 50s. You'll still see that music used in some TV shows and movies every now and then. It survives a little bit better. Because, of course, the 50s is when, I would say, for lack of a better term, popular music and youth culture really kind of came into its own. Because obviously we're going to start off with Chuck Berry and Elvis. I mean, you can't talk about the 50s without acknowledging them. Almost everybody knows who they are. It's, even now, it's not like people don't know who Chuck Berry and Elvis are. Let's see, who else do we got? Now, I don't know who I've never heard of Link Ray or Scotty Moore before either. So, there you go. Bo Diddley, I'm familiar with. Fats Domino, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Big Joe Turner. Okay, yes. All of them. Yeah, obviously. Gene Vincent, don't know them. I don't know Johnny Ray, the Crew Cuts, or the Fontaine Sisters. Now, I do know, I didn't know Bill Haley wrote We're Gonna Rock Around the Clock, but I know that song pretty well. Pat Boone, yes, I know Pat Boone. Mostly because of the Joke album where he did a bunch of metal songs. That stuff survives, I think, because, like I said, it's just extremely well documented. My parents kind of grew up with a lot of that music because they were born in the 1950s. So they were, heavily exposed to that music. And, but they are probably, my parents were born in the later part of the 50s and they're in their early 60s now. So as far as who are the youngest people who grew up with that type of music, probably people of my parents' generation. And, 20 or 30 years from now, all of the people who really grew up with that stuff will be, well, let's face it, dead. So that's that. That's the 50s. Now, next thing we're going to talk are about the 60s. I'm going to kind of limp. I'm going to link the 60s and the 70s together. I'm not going to bother kind of breaking them down too much individually because the 60s and 70s, obviously, that was very much the music of my parents. It slightly predates me. And obviously this stuff is still remembered because stuff from, you know, the 60s and 70s is still played on the radio all the time. Really, from the 60s on, it's all played on the radio. Even now in 2017, you hear stuff from the 60s on the radio all the time. So let's see, who do we got? The Beatles, duh. Okay, yeah. I don't need to talk about the Beatles. Rolling Stones, don't need to talk about the Rolling Stones. Let's see, what else we got? Now, Roy Orbison, I don't know who that is. Yeah, Bob Dylan, duh, of course. Velvet Underground, I heard. Yep, okay. And now we're going to talk about The Doors and Jimi Hendrix. Again, this stuff is played on classic rock radio all the flippin' time. And we could go on and on and on about the 1960s. But there's not really much point at that because, again, that stuff is still all played on the radio. Now, growing up, I didn't particularly have great interest in that type of music. It was really when I hit my early 20s that I really started to appreciate that type of music. You know, I really got into the classic rock of the 60s and the 70s in that time period. Because before that, I just listened to mostly stuff from 80s and the 90s because that's when I grew up. But I did go back to, quote, the generation before me, and I really appreciate a lot of music from that time period. As far as my kids go, are they going to be into it? They hear a fair amount of music. I play it a fair amount, and they like some of it. But is it something they're going to really get into? Iffy. But again, I know that all of these artists I'm talking about so far are really kind of proving Chris's original point, which is only stuff that is really popular survives, right? Stuff that is second or third tier falls away. So anyway, next up, we're going to skip the 70s, 80s, and 90s altogether because that stuff is still played all the time. And we're going to jump ahead to, quote, the current era, right? We're going to talk about the 2000s, okay? We're going to start with the 2000s anyway. And let's see, what do we got here? I don't know why they're showing Michael Jackson for the 2000s, at least a photo of him, because he wasn't super relevant to that decade as far as music goes. He was definitely a big artist in the 80s and 90s, not so much in the 2000s, but whatever. So let's see, what was the... Okay, we're going to talk about NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears, and Christina Aguilera. Okay, Beyonce, Rihanna. Whoop-de-doo. We've got the Libertines, Oasis, Linda Thomas, Travis, Dido, Blur, The Hives, Borjak, and Radiohead. Okay? Alright. Sorry, I'm just trying to kind of jump ahead to artists. Okay, and then we got hip artists like Outkast, the Black Eyed Peas, T.I., 50 Cent, Kanye West, Nas, Jay-Z, Snoop Dogg, Missy Elliott, blah, 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 Eminem. Yeah. Soulja Boy, Jibs, The Backwoods, Purple Ribbon, whatever. It's boring. Yeah, so anyway, obviously we had some stuff kind of rise up in the 2000s, and that's the kind of stuff that it was. And some of that stuff is already starting to be forgotten a bit, even now. I mean, even though that was just from the last decade, some of that stuff is falling away already, right? So let's look at the current decade, the 2010s, okay? So we got, let's see here. Katy Perry and Rihanna. Okay, let's see. Mumford & Sons, Vance Joy, Philip Phillips. Nothing more. Highly Suspect, 12-Fit Ninja, Dead Litter. Okay, whatever. EDM, of course, so we're going to talk about Skrillex there, I'm sure, somewhere. Oh, yeah, there he is. Steve Aoki, Swedish House Mafia, Headhunters, Wild Styles, the T-Kaz, Clean Bandit, whatever. It's not really my style of music, so sorry if I'm mispronouncing these. Teen Pop, oh yeah, wonderful shit, right. Miley Cyrus, Demi Lovato, Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, oh god. Okay, so, yeah, this is what's popular, I guess, nowadays. I think that has a lot to do with culture, in addition to that. So, anyway, we're going to now kind of look at a few radio stations here in Cincinnati, right, which plays, I'm trying to think here. This is the Oldies station in Cincinnati, and it has been kind of relegated to AM, right? It plays stuff. It's not even an FM channel. So, yeah. And they play stuff from like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? So earlier they were playing the Supremes. I've had this website up for a little bit. This is the kind of stuff they play. Righteous Brothers, Aretha Franklin, yada, yada, yada. Let's click on, email your request. Programming. This is going to be like the shows they play. It's not going to give like a real history here of kind of what we got. So we'll just kind of let that go. But the actual oldie station is now relegated to AM radio, which is obviously, let's be honest, the radio is kind of a dying thing anyway, as I've talked about in some of my other videos. Next up, we're going to talk about this station here is called WGRR. I remember when I was a kid, okay, this pretty much only played music when I was a kid. Anytime you would turn it on, you would hear something from like the 50s, maybe the 50s or early 60s at best. It was always like easy listening kind of. It was not my favorite music to listen to, but it was definitely an oldie, and it still kind of is. But the thing is, since we're now 30 years in the future from where we were, God, that makes me feel old, but that's reality. They play now stuff pretty much. They'll play stuff now that I actually like. Like they'll play stuff from they'll play actual rock, not just old pop music from the 50s and early 60s. They'll play like the Doors or Led Zeppelin, or they'll play or hell, I've heard Guns N' Roses on this station. So it kind of makes me just go, yikes, right? So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and kind of cut off this screen feed, and then we're going to come back full screen with the camera, and we're going to kind of talk about the state of things and kind of where I think it might go in the future. So be right back, guys. All right, guys. So let's kind of review a little bit what we talked about and kind of talk about what I think the future holds. Obviously, in the first part of the video, I talked about some of the classical composers, and that predates recorded music altogether. And popular music wasn't really much of a concept back then, probably. At least not the way we think of it. Obviously, there were songs that I'm sure traveled from like performer to performer, and a lot of people heard, but it was certainly not even remotely close to what we think of. And like I said, those guys were separated by hundreds of years, because back then there was not mass media as far as music goes. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. So I think that's probably a large part of the reason why so much of the music from that time period of hundreds of years, oh hell, who am I kidding, thousands of years of human history, it's completely like, dust in the wind, buried under the sands of time. It's just because there wasn't really any way to document it, for lack of a better term. So then we're going to, of course, kind of leap forward to, the much more modern era. And we're going to start with the 50s. We're not even going to bother talking about before that. And the reason we're going to start in the 50s is with the 50s, obviously, that's pretty much when everybody had a radio in their house. Almost pretty much everybody had a record player in their house, too, in the 1950s. And that's when teen culture kind of became a thing unto itself. And the teenagers and kids of the time obviously identified themselves by the music that they pursued and yada, 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 right? And people had millions and millions of people had the shared experience of listening to the same radio stations, right? Or same radio networks. So obviously that would make, music a gigantically well-known, popular thing. And then, of course, the same thing just continued on with, for decades, right? And then, of course, in the 60s, by the 60s, everybody had a television. And I'm pretty sure that's when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan and all that bullshit. And, of course, other acts and, obviously, that kind of thing just continued, right? And then up until the advent of the internet, there were ways, the music industry just grew and grew and grew and grew because people were able to seek out more and more music, customize it a bit, with later, obviously, with tapes. People could trade tapes to each other, tape their friends' records or whatever, and really get exposure to a lot of different things, which, of course, led to more esoteric stuff kind of rising up and making it. And good times were had by all, right? And then, of course, I think what started to... And I think that's why so many of those bands from the pre-internet era are, still well known, is because just everybody knew those acts, right? Now, if we fast forward to now, to the internet era, right, the 2000s and the 2010s, you have a lot more fracturing, for lack of a better term. People are able to, kind of tune into their own kind of sphere of interest, right? For example, myself, I look at several heavy metal related websites every day. I don't, go to, say, country music news whatever, because I have zero interest in country music. So I'm not perusing about that. And I could not tell you who the most popular country music artist is in this country, nor do I care. I couldn't do the same thing for any genre, really. Maybe rock. I don't know. Probably not even rock. I don't know who any of the really popular... obviously I know who, like, Justin Bieber and shit is, but the majority of really popular music nowadays, I am completely out of touch with it because I have no real interest in it. And I think that's, again, related to being able to kind of insulate yourself and only paying attention to what you're actually interested in, which is going to lead to less shared experiences, which means artists aren't going to have as wide of a reach as they once did because not everybody's going to know them, yada, yada, yada. So I think, in a way, it's going to be easier for artists to be forgotten over time than ever before. But like I said, I think all I've really done is really prove Chris's point that stuff that's not top 40 doesn't survive. Now, I have a question, and this is really just for anybody to say whatever the hell they want. I'm going to name a couple of artists, and we're going to ask ourselves, are they going to be remembered in 100 years? We're going to ask about, let's say, Metallica, Michael Jackson, Johnny Cash. Let's see, what's another giant of music that I really like? And we'll go with The Doors, right? And then we'll throw out Britney Spears and Justin Bieber, right? Joking aside, will any of those artists be remembered 100 years from now? Hard to say. Because 100 years from now, will anybody care about any of those artists? I don't know. I mean, it's right now. Obviously, a few of those, obviously two of those kind of stick out like a sore thumb, but they are very fucking popular, regardless of my personal opinion of them. The other four, obviously, are in my, kind of like musical gods, for lack of a better term, and will anybody care about them 100 years from now when all of, the living fans of those bands are dead, and, maybe even the kids of the people who like those artists, when they're all gone, is anybody going to care about them? Hard to say. It's really hard to know because, like I said, we're getting more fractured. But at the same time, the contradiction to that is now with digital technology, where you can record more shit better than ever. We can, archive literally everything. So it's kind of a very strange contradiction in terms. So, in 100 years, is some weird future version of me on the weird future version of YouTube going to be, doing a 3D holographic video about obscure, forgotten musical artists? Oh, 100 years ago, there was this band called Metallica that were really popular. Who knows, right? Anyway, I'd really be interested to hear what you guys think in the comments below. That pretty much wraps this up. As always, if you enjoyed this, thumbs up. If you hated it, thumbs down. Share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.